At 2,340 on December 29, 1944, Major Carroll C. Smith was seated in the tight cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow at Moorfield, Morrow, closely watching his radar operator track a target moving at 180 knots through the dark skies north of the Philippines. Smith, 26 years old with 43 combat missions and 4 confirmed kills, knew the enemy's pattern well. For 2 weeks, Japanese bombers had targeted Morrow every night, trying to destroy the American airfields being built to support the upcoming Lingayen Gulf invasion. The Japanese sent bombers each night, conventional bombers, kamikazes, anything they could use to carry explosives. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had just arrived on December 26th, and Smith's squadron was the only line of defense standing between the bombers and 20,000 American troops sleeping below. Every successful bomber attack meant more American casualties, delayed airfields, and a postponed invasion. Smith's P-61 Black Widow was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. The Northrop Black Widow, the first American plane built for night combat, was equipped with twin R2800 engines, producing 2,000 horsepower each and a radar system that could detect enemy aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness. The Japanese believed they could hide under the cover of night, but the radar proved them wrong. Behind Smith, Lieutenant Philip Porter, the radar operator, tracked targets, guiding Smith towards the enemy bombers. However, the challenge was massive. 1 P-61, 12 bombers. Smith could only intercept a few before running out of fuel and leaving the rest to attack the airfields. The 418th had been training for 18 months for this, flying night missions using experimental radar systems and training at Orlando Army Airfield in Florida. Their first combat mission came in November 1943, and by September 1944, the P-61 Black Widow was in use. But tonight, Smith faced a new challenge: 12 bombers attacking at once, and his fuel would only last 3 hours. If he spent 10 minutes on each bomber, he could only intercept 3, leaving 9 to destroy the airfields. Porter's voice crackled over the intercom at 2,342. He had 4 separate targets on the radar, all heading toward Morrow at different altitudes. Smith had to make a quick decision: which bomber to attack first. He pushed the throttles forward, and the Black Widow surged into action. With no moon or stars to guide him, Smith relied on his radar to see in the pitch-black sky. The radar's rotating parabolic dish sent out microwave pulses, detecting aircraft up to 5 miles away. Porter called out directions, guiding Smith toward the bomber, and Smith activated his own radar scope to track the target visually. The Japanese bomber was a Mitsubishi G4M, known as the Betty. It was slow and vulnerable, with no tail warning radar. The P-61's radar could track it in the dark, and Smith closed in. The bomber's crew had no idea they were being pursued. As Smith got closer, he adjusted his position, moving slightly below and behind the bomber. He lined up the shot, the 4 20mm cannons in the P-61's belly aimed at the target. Smith's training kicked in, and he took aim, ready to fire and eliminate the threat. Smith's P-61 carried 800 rounds, enough for about 40 seconds of continuous fire. However, Smith knew that night fighter tactics called for short, precise bursts. The goal was to get close, fire, confirm the kill, and move on to the next target. Wasting ammo on one bomber could mean not having enough for the others. At 350 yards, Smith squeezed the trigger. The 4 cannons fired together, their deafening sound barely audible over the engine noise. The high-explosive rounds tore toward the Japanese bomber, a Mitsubishi G4M, nicknamed Betty, at 2,800 feet per second. The tracers blazed like red lines in the night sky, Smith fired for 2 seconds, sending 48 rounds toward the Betty. The right wing exploded, instantly igniting the fuel. The bomber rolled and dove steeply. Smith watched it plummet, burning bright against the clouds below. It crashed into the water 8 miles north of Morro at 2,357. 1 bomber down, 11 remaining, but Smith's fuel gauge showed he had burned through 15% of his fuel, and 3 more targets were still on Porter's radar, all heading for the airfields. Smith had only 112 minutes of fuel left. At 0014 on December 30th, Porter identified a second target. It was 23 miles away, heading south at 6,000 feet. Smith accelerated to 320 miles per hour, burning through fuel faster to reach the bomber before it got closer to the airfields. He had no time to waste. The bomber, another Betty, flew straight and level. Smith moved into position and fired. The rounds tore through the bomber's wings and engines, turning it into a fireball. The Betty spiraled down, crashing into the water at 0019. 2 bombers down, 10 remaining. With only 42% fuel remaining, Smith faced another tough decision. There were 2 more bombers on Porter's radar, one at 9,000 feet, the other at 4,000 feet. Smith chose to pursue the higher target first, even though it meant the lower bomber would get closer to the airfields. Climbing to 9,000 feet, Smith closed in on the third target. This bomber was a Nakajima Ki-49, also called Helen. It was faster than the Betty and more maneuverable, and its tail gunner posed a significant threat. Smith adjusted his approach, coming from below and to the left, aiming for the bomber's vulnerable belly. At 600 yards, the bomber's tail gunner opened fire, but Smith was already on target. He squeezed the trigger, sending 72 rounds toward the Helen. The right engine exploded, and the bomber spun out of control, crashing into the ocean at 0029. 3 bombers down, 9 remaining, but Smith's fuel gauge read just 28%. With critical fuel levels, he knew he had to make his next move carefully. Altitude 4,000 feet, range 9 miles. This was the bomber Smith had previously bypassed, the one flying at low altitude. Now it was only 12 miles from Morro, close enough that Smith could see the searchlights from the American airfield sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft gunners were ready, fingers on triggers, awaiting targets. Smith descended toward the bomber, diving to conserve fuel. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, and leveled off at 4,200 feet, just above the target. This altitude advantage gave Smith a better position to attack, allowing him to dive on the bomber and increase his speed with gravity. The closer he got, the less time the bomber had to react. At 1 mile, Smith could clearly see the bomber. It was another Betty, flying straight toward Morro with no evasive action. The pilot either didn't know about the American night fighters or didn't care, believing the mission more important than his own survival. Japanese bomber crews were often willing to sacrifice themselves to complete their objectives. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the bomber, 350 yards away. He checked his ammunition counter, 512 rounds left. Enough for a few more attacks, but this was the 4th bomber, and Smith knew he had to make each shot count. His fuel gauge showed 23%, below safety levels. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have enough fuel to try again. At 0034, Smith fired a second burst, 48 rounds. The shells ripped through the Betty's fuselage, separating its port wings and rupturing the fuel tanks. Fire spread across the remaining wing, and the bomber rolled left, diving toward the ocean. The Betty crashed into the water at 0035, 4 bombers down in 55 minutes. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Morro, his fuel gauge now showing 21%. The math was simple. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The P-61 consumed 100 gallons at cruise speed, and Smith had roughly 60 gallons left. Enough for 36 minutes of flight, more than enough to reach base. Unless something went wrong. Porter checked the radar again, but there were no more contacts. The remaining 8 bombers had turned back. Whether they were scared off by Smith's attacks or just lost their nerve didn't matter. The mission was a success. 4 bombers destroyed, 0 American casualties, and the airfields were safe. The construction crews could continue their work, and the invasion schedule remained intact. But Smith's night wasn't over. At 0042, Porter detected a new contact heading north. It was 4 miles away at 7,000 feet. Smith was 12 miles from McGuire Field with 19% fuel remaining. If this new contact was another Japanese bomber, it could be heading toward the airfields he had just defended. Engaging it would consume more fuel, possibly too much. Smith couldn't risk letting it go. If he allowed a 5th bomber to reach Morro, all his work would be undone. He turned toward the contact. Porter called out the vectors as the range quickly closed. At 800 yards, Smith could see it wasn't a bomber but a Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, a Frank, a powerful single-engine fighter, faster and more maneuverable than the P-61, and armed with 4 12.7 mm machine guns and 2 20 mm cannons. It was one of the best Japanese fighters in service. But in the darkness, the Frank pilot had no radar, only his eyes to search for targets. Smith had the advantage of surprise. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the Frank, approaching from its blind spot. The Frank was flying straight and level, unaware of the danger. Smith closed to 300 yards, his fuel gauge showing 17%. If he missed this shot, he wouldn't have enough fuel to try again. With no time to waste, Smith centered the target in his gun sight and squeezed the trigger. The 72 rounds tore through the Frank's tail section and engine, causing it to burst into flames. The Frank spiraled downward, and Smith watched as the pilot ejected at 3,000 feet. The Frank crashed into the ocean at 0046, but Smith's fuel was now down to 15%. Smith's fuel consumption had been higher than expected, but he still had enough to reach McGuire Field, just. The airfield was 11 miles away. With 15% fuel remaining, Smith had roughly 22 minutes of flight time, but any miscalculation or headwind could leave him stranded. Porter guided Smith toward Morro using radar. The runway lights appeared on the scope, just 12 dim lamps marking the way. Smith descended to 2,000 feet with only 13% fuel left. At 280 miles per hour, he had about 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. At 0052, Smith spotted the runway lights. The airfield, completed only days before, had no instrument landing system, so Smith relied on the row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. The runway was 5,000 feet long, made of crushed coral, just enough for the P-61. Smith descended carefully, his fuel running low. With every second counting, he lined up for the landing, praying that his fuel would last long enough to touch down safely. There were no crash barriers at McGuire Field. If Smith landed too quickly or too slowly, the aircraft would veer off the runway. With minimal lighting at night, any mistake during landing could be fatal. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%, with 57 gallons remaining. The P-61 consumed fuel quickly during the landing approach as power settings fluctuated during turns and descents. Each adjustment in power used more fuel. Smith calculated that he had about 12 minutes of fuel left, more than enough for a safe landing. Unless something went wrong. At 0055, something did go wrong. The runway lights went out, all 12 lamps extinguishing simultaneously, leaving complete darkness. Smith was 3 miles from the runway at 800 feet altitude and 140 knots of airspeed. Without the runway lights, he had no visual reference for landing. If he descended too quickly, the P-61 would hit the ground before he realized how low he was. Porter suggested using the radar altimeter, which measures height by bouncing radio waves off the ground. Smith could descend slowly, trusting the altimeter and his navigation to guide him. This method was risky. Any error could lead to landing off the runway and into trees, coral reefs, or construction equipment. With only 9% fuel left, Smith had no time to divert to another airfield. Tacabo, 90 miles away, was the nearest alternative, but the P-61 would run out of fuel 40 miles short. His only option was to land at McGuire Field. He had survived 4 intercepts and 5 kills, and he knew that dying now because of the extinguished runway lights would make the mission pointless. Smith turned the P-61 toward where he believed the runway was. His altitude was now 600 feet, with fuel at 9%. The darkness below was complete. He descended to 400 feet, and the radar altimeter showed 380 feet above the ground. Smith reduced airspeed to 120 knots. The P-61's stall speed was 95 knots, so this gave him a small safety margin. The mathematics were unforgiving. Porter monitored the radar scope, confirming Smith's location. The coastline of Murrow appeared on the radar, with the airfield 1 mile inland. Smith used the compass to navigate, heading 180 degrees toward the runway. At 0058, Smith extended the landing gear. The green indicator lights showed that all 3 wheels were down and locked. Smith knew the P-61's landing gear was strong enough to withstand rough airfields, but landing without visual references meant he couldn't judge his landing spot. He might land too hard and collapse the gear, leading to a catastrophic crash. At 7% fuel and just 5 minutes of flight time left, Smith extended the flaps fully. The aircraft slowed to 110 knots, and the descent rate increased to 300 feet per minute. The radar altimeter showed 250 feet, then 200, 150, and 100 feet. With no visual references, Smith could only rely on the instruments and hope his navigation was accurate. As he reached 75 feet, he reduced power, increasing the descent rate to 400 feet per minute to reach the ground before the fuel ran out. At 50 feet, 25 feet, Smith braced for touchdown. His hands gripped the controls as the P-61's main wheels hit the crushed coral runway at 59. The impact was harder than normal, but the landing gear held. 3 seconds later, the nose wheel touched down. Smith applied the brakes, rapidly slowing the aircraft down to 20 knots. Unable to see where he was on the runway, he kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. His fuel gauge showed 6%. With only 29 gallons left, just 3 minutes of fuel remaining. The ground crew arrived with flashlights, guiding him to the parking area. Smith shut down the engines at 0103, exactly 1 hour and 3 minutes after taking off. He climbed out of the cockpit, his legs stiff and hands shaking not from fear, but from exhaustion. In just 63 minutes of combat, he had made 5 intercepts, destroyed 5 enemy aircraft, and performed a blind landing. Porter, who had been with him throughout the mission, climbed out from the radar compartment. He had tracked all 5 targets, helping Smith make each intercept possible. The teamwork of pilot and radar operator was what made these kills possible. The ground crew inspected the P-61, finding no damage. All 4 cannons had functioned perfectly, and Smith had expended 408 rounds, leaving 392 remaining. Intelligence officers arrived at 0115, wanting to know all the details of the mission. Smith provided them from memory. 4 Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-49 Helen bomber, and 1 Nakajima Ki-84 Frankfurter, all destroyed between 2,357 on December 29th and 0046 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through radar tracking and reports from coast watchers, who had seen the bombers crash into the ocean. Smith had made history. His 4 kills in one night equaled the record for American night fighters. But he wasn't finished. On December 30th, at 14:30, he flew a second mission after refueling and rearming the P-61. This time, he targeted Japanese reconnaissance aircraft over Muro at 15:12. Porter detected another contact, a Nakajima Ki-84 Frankfurter. Smith dove on the target, increasing his speed to 390 miles per hour, faster than the Frank's top speed. At 400 yards, he fired a 2-second burst, sending 48 rounds into the Frank. The fighter exploded and dove into the ocean. It was Smith's 7th confirmed kill. This made Smith the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II with 7 confirmed kills in less than 24 hours of combat. No other American night fighter pilot would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations, ultimately achieving 18 kills, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. The P-61 Black Widow continued flying combat missions until May 1945. After which it was retired, replaced by jet-powered fighters. Though the P-61 was scrapped after the war, only 4 Black Widows still exist today, and none is Smith's aircraft. The records of his achievements are preserved in military archives and unit histories. Smith survived the war, returned to the United States in 1946, left the military, and never sought publicity or fame. The P-61 Black Widow had proven its worth in night combat, and Carroll Smith had shown the world what a skilled night fighter pilot could do. If you were moved by this story, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications to keep these forgotten stories alive.